Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I'm going to be talking about KeyForge and whether the game KeyForge could be a threat to the game of Dungeons and Dragons. All right, so I've talked a lot about KeyForge and how it compares to Magic the Gathering, and I think most people understand that KeyForge directly competes with Magic the Gathering as a collectible card game and a unique deck game. Those two categories are so close together that it's very obvious that KeyForge and Magic the Gathering are in direct competition, and that people are going to spend money out of a card game spending pool that for KeyForge that very, very directly could have went to Magic the Gathering, right? However, most people would not see KeyForge as a competitor to Dungeons and Dragons, right? Now, the reality is, I think even 4 months ago, KeyForge would not have been a competitor to Dungeons and Dragons. It would have been its own unique product in a different product category. But something that Wizards of the Coast recently did changed that. It put Dungeons and Dragons in the trajectory to be a competitor, or to be a competitor of KeyForge, and that is the Guilds of Ravnica setting book for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. The Guilds of Ravnica setting book for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is a historically important book. And the reason why is, for 5th edition, there were no official setting books. There were only, so setting books are, as I'm defining them, a hardback book that has been in every single edition of the game, 1st edition, 2nd edition, 3rd edition, 4th edition. There's been a hardback book, 200 pages plus, which presents a setting in a traditional manner. Here's the races, here's the classes, here's the locations, here's the politics, right? That has existed in every single edition of the game except 5th edition. And until Guilds of Ravnica, there were 0 setting books for 5th edition, and Mike Merles, the lead designer, had essentially said, without saying it directly, that there never would be setting books, because he had this very distinct. He said it with action, without words, right? And that's a debatable topic, but I feel strongly that is correct. All right, but somebody at Wizards of the Coast realized that the synergy between Magic the Gathering and Dungeons and Dragons was very strong, and that commercially using Magic the Gathering settings as official Dungeons and Dragons settings made immense commercial sense, right? So one of the things is the Guilds of Ravnica book. It is quite arguable that it took a very minimal amount of time to build. And it took less money to build than any other book they've ever made. And the reason why is the setting didn't have to be written. It was already built for Magic the Gathering, and the art was all recycled, right? So you're just pasting some art pieces over. You already have the structure for the setting, and you're just doing a little bit of polish and a little bit of tweak, right? And you could do this for dozens, literally dozens of settings. And you could also make it so that you never produced another unique Dungeons and Dragons setting, and you never recycled any of the old Dungeons and Dragons setting, because you already have literally probably low millions of dollars worth of art in Magic the Gathering that could be reworked for Dungeons and Dragons, and probably hundreds of thousands of dollars of design work in the settings, which can be brought right over. So commercially, it makes a ton of sense. However, because Magic the Gathering and Dungeons and Dragons are now connected through Ravnica, right, and Magic the Gathering is an official, the Magic the Gathering setting is officially part of a Dungeons and Dragons setting, that does put KeyForge in as an absolute direct competitor, in my opinion, to Dungeons and Dragons. So one, basically, right now, Dungeons and Dragons is trying to bring over Magic the Gathering players and say, hey, we want your money in Dungeons and Dragons. We're getting your money in Magic the Gathering. We want your money being spent over on Dungeons and Dragons product. KeyForge has the direct possibility, and I think it's already happening, where KeyForge is taking dollars out of the hands of Wizards of the Coast from those dollars not being spent on Magic the Gathering cards, right? And because they're doing a big push right now to bring Magic the Gathering players over to Dungeons and Dragons, that could be impacting the amount of Magic the Gathering players that would have come to Dungeons and Dragons through Magic the Gathering. If Magic the Gathering is overall being reduced by 1%, 5%, 10%, I don't think the amount is any higher than that as far as impact from KeyForge right now. It could grow higher. It certainly could grow higher. I think it could impact up to 33% or 50% within as little as 3 years, right, from KeyForge's impact on Magic the Gathering. But so that is a direct impact to Dungeons & Dragons, but it's limited. It's between 1 and 10% over the next year in my expectations, right? That is my estimate, right? But the real threat, the real absolute threat for Dungeons & Dragons from KeyForge is Richard Garfield, right? So Dungeons & Dragons really wasn't in the scope of Richard Garfield. He didn't need to worry about it, right? But right now, I do think Richard Garfield is thinking a lot about KeyForge, right? Well, KeyForge competes directly with Magic the Gathering, and now Dungeons & Dragons and KeyForge are braided together, right? So as Richard Garfield thinks about Magic the Gathering and how to make KeyForge grow and how to push Magic the Gathering back so that KeyForge can grow within the CCG market, one of the biggest possibilities on how KeyForge could be a massive threat to Dungeons & Dragons is if Richard Garfield sets his mind to innovation in the TRPG space. That is a deadly threat to Dungeons & Dragons, and here's why. All right, so one, we are seeing collectible card game mechanics coming into Dungeons & Dragons through the Guilds of Ravnica book, okay? Richard Garfield had no reason to do innovation or to build products in the space of tabletop role-playing games because his world never really crossed over, Magic the Gathering never really crossed over with Dungeons & Dragons, which is the flagship, the banner carrier for all of tabletop role-playing games. But now D&D is right up in CCG's business, right? Dungeons & Dragons and Magic the Gathering are intimately braided. I believe that going forward, the vast majority of all settings for Dungeons & Dragons will be Magic the Gathering settings, okay? That's a big deal, right? So here's the threat that Dungeons & Dragons could have from KeyForge that could be a very, very significant threat. And that is if Richard Garfield decides to make or even be involved with a TRPG for KeyForge. So basically we have Magic the Gathering has now attached a role-playing game to their CCG. If Richard Garfield does the same thing and says, okay, we're going to have a KeyForge tabletop role-playing game, right? If Richard Garfield starts thinking about tabletop role-playing games and then applies his mind to tabletop role-playing games, that could be a massive threat to Dungeons & Dragons. And here's why. We have seen the scope of KeyForge is massive. I think the scope of KeyForge, the idea of unique decks and proving that you can make a product that is unique in 3 different layers and that you can use high math and high code to build completely unique products. I think we're going to see it in sneakers. I think we're going to see it in jewelry. I think we're going to see it in a million different products that go way beyond games, right? And Richard Garfield has done, KeyForge is an industry feat. It's not just a game feat, right? Richard Garfield with Magic the Gathering and with KeyForge has proven twice that he is a first-to-market thinker. He brings ideas and innovations that no one else has even thought of, right? And then he can execute on them. That makes him a dangerous man, right? Now, here's the other kicker. There have only been 2 innovations in the 44 years of tabletop role-playing games. Player agency through Powered by Apocalypse, and then narrative dice from Fantasy Flight Games. Whoa! Narrative dice from Fantasy Flight Games. So one of the true innovations in tabletop role-playing games, and there have been extremely few actual innovations in tabletop role-playing games in the 44 years that they've come forward. I'm talking significant innovation, not just a rules tweak here or there, is player agency and also narrative dice. The narrative dice is a huge innovation within TRPGs. All right, but if Richard Garfield sets his mind to TRPG innovation, because that is such a dry desert, right? I think that Richard Garfield could come up with something that could hit TRPG landscape like a comet and could really genuinely pull a ton of people over and could double or triple or even quadruple the amount of people who are playing tabletop role-playing games today, which we already know that number. There's probably about 15 million people in the world playing TRPGs today, but that number could jump to 30, 45, 60 million people, right? If Richard Garfield applies his mind, applies his first-to-market thinking to TRPGs, brings a genuine innovation into TRPGs through a KeyForge tabletop role-playing game, that could be a massive, massive threat to Dungeons and Dragons. And so KeyForge was not a threat to Dungeons and Dragons because Dungeons and Dragons wasn't intimately braided to collectible card games, which it now is through the Guilds of Ravnica setting book. I feel bad for WotC. I think the timing on the Guilds of Ravnica setting book was way bad, not good at all. I don't think there was really there wasn't any way for them to avoid this. Just there's a lot of moving parts in life. These things happen, but I absolutely think that KeyForge is an absolute threat to Dungeons and Dragons. From about 1 to 10% of its market share this year alone could get swept up from KeyForge because Guilds of Ravnica has been tied to Dungeons and Dragons. And then if at any point Richard Garfield says, I'm jumping in, I'm going to bring my first-to-market thinking to tabletop role-playing games, I think he's incredibly capable of actually innovating within the space of tabletop role-playing games, which have had extremely limited innovation. But I think Richard Garfield is an innovator, the likes of which we have probably not seen in 3 centuries. And so that could be a real threat. That's my thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think. And please consider liking and subscribing. Thank you.